My mother-in-law thinks I'm unworthy of her son, but unexpected events. I am facing difficulties in my relationship with my husband's mother. My mother-in-law's coldness, criticism, and constant interference make my life unbearable. Despite efforts to mend relations, my mother-in-law considers me unworthy of her son. The conflicts reach a climax when my mother-in-law decides to move in with us, turning the house into a battlefield. Eventually, I am forced to leave, but an unexpected turn of events forces me to reconsider my relationship with my husband and mother-in-law. My name is Anna. I was born and raised in a small town in the American South. My life was pretty peaceful until I met Jack. My story started out like a normal dream. Girl meets guy, falls in love, gets married. But this fairy tale had an evil wizard, Margaret's mother-in-law. Jack's father left the family when he was still a teenager, and Margaret was the sole person raising him. When we first started dating, her cold attitude didn't bother me much. Yes, she didn't smile when we met, and yes, she always found a reason to criticize, but I chalked it up to the usual jealousy of whoever took the place next to her son. After all, Jack was a grown man, and I believed that our love could overcome any difficulties. But everything changed when we announced our engagement. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter in our story, filled with joy and anticipation of future happiness. Instead of the expected celebration and congratulations, I was confronted with an icy wall of alienation. Margaret, usually so reserved and correct, this time showed a complete lack of emotion. Her gaze was colder than ice, and her lips remained tightly compressed into a thin line. Not a single congratulation, not a single kind word, only a heavy silence, as if she was not happy about the event. Though Margaret never said out loud that she thought I was unworthy of her son, I felt it on an intuitive level. Every look in her eyes, every movement, betrayed an underlying disapproval. She seemed to see me as a threat, as an attempt to take away her dearest person. Her behavior was like dancing around a minefield. She tried to avoid direct contact, but her dislike hung in the air like an invisible fog. My parents, unfortunately, were unable to attend this important event due to work commitments. Their absence made the atmosphere even more painful. But Margaret, of course, came to the party. She took a seat in the farthest corner of the hall, as if trying to stay away from everyone else. She spent the entire evening in the shadows, avoiding socializing not only with me, but with my friends as well. I caught her glances, full of hidden anxiety and discontent, and my heart clenched with a sense of loneliness and misunderstanding. Despite all this, I continued to hope that this was a temporary discontent. Perhaps Margaret just needed time to accept the idea that her son had chosen another woman. I convinced myself that in time she would get used to the idea of our marriage and begin to treat me with respect and warmth. But alas, the reality turned out to be much more complicated and painful than I could have imagined. However, the closer we got to the wedding date, the more tense things became. Margaret interfered with literally everything from dress selection to the guest list. Oh, the wedding dress was a special story. Margaret suggested I wear her own dress that she was getting married in. Needless to say, when I imagined how old or even centuries old that dress was, I instantly lost all desire to go to the wedding. I politely declined, saying that I would let her keep it in case she was lucky enough to wear it more than once. Her face literally twisted. She insisted on inviting her old acquaintances, whom Jack barely knew, and refused to include my close friends. Every time I tried to discuss it with Jack, he'd reply that Mom knew better, because she'd been through this before. Jack didn't see anything wrong with it. A week before the wedding, my parents finally arrived, and we had a long-awaited dinner to introduce them to Jack's family. The meeting promised to be tense, given the chilly relationship I had with Margaret. But to my surprise, she was completely transformed. Instead of the usual cold aloofness I'd seen over the past few months, she was a real lady, friendly, courteous, and sincere. Margaret lavished compliments on my parents, admiring their kindness, wisdom, and warmth. She seemed to transform herself before my eyes, becoming the embodiment of hospitality and friendliness. As for me, I was suddenly surrounded by an avalanche of praise. Margaret couldn't stop saying what a wonderful daughter-in-law I was, how well I ran the house, What a fine choice her son had made. She called me the best, the most beautiful, the most talented. The stream of flattering words seemed endless. At first, I was just dumbfounded by this sudden turn of events. It was as if all this time I had been living in some parallel world where Margaret was a completely different woman. But gradually I began to realize that it was all part of a carefully thought-out plan. She was playing the role of the perfect mother-in-law, trying to impress my parents and strengthen her position in the family. After all, it's hard to say no to someone who praises you and your family so sincerely. This meeting left me with an ambivalent feeling. On the one hand, I was glad that my parents saw Margaret's good side and did not feel the tension between us. But on the other hand, I couldn't help thinking that it was all just a pretense, an artificial facade designed to achieve a specific purpose. The wedding went beautifully, despite Margaret's constant attempts to control every aspect of the event. I thought things would calm down afterward, that she would accept my presence in her son's life. But I was wrong. The real trouble started after we returned from our honeymoon. We settled into a cozy apartment near downtown. Jack worked hard as a lawyer for a large company, and I did household chores and freelance part-time. Nothing seemed to portend trouble. But soon I noticed that Margaret was calling Jack more often, demanding under any pretext that he visit her. At first it was once a week, then twice, and then it became a daily occurrence. Every time Jack stayed over at his mom's house, I was alone in the empty apartment, listening to the silence and wondering why his mother was so insistent on bringing us into her life. I began to notice a change in Jack's behavior. He was no longer interested in my affairs. Conversations about the future had turned into discussions of Margaret's problems. He would arrive tired, sleepy, and go to bed. I brought the matter up with Jack more than once, but every time he just waved it off, saying that his mother just needed a little help. Nevertheless, this support gradually turned into a real addiction. She was constantly calling Jack for every little thing. A leaky faucet, a trip to the doctor, a trip to buy groceries. And every time, Jack would drop everything he was doing and rush to her rescue. Gradually, I began to feel superfluous in our marriage. My role was reduced to cooking dinners and keeping the house in order, while all of Jack's emotional energy went to meeting his mother's needs. My attempts to draw my husband's attention to our relationship ended in arguments and accusations that I was selfish and didn't realize how important family was to him. This went on for several years. I put up with it, hoping the situation would change on its own, but it just got worse. Margaret started coming to our house uninvited, criticizing my housekeeping, giving advice on raising children we didn't have yet, meddling in literally everything. Her interference became so intrusive that I began to think about divorce. Then one day, when I was ready to put an end to our relationship, something unexpected happened. Margaret became ill. The doctors diagnosed her with a serious illness that required constant care. Jack, of course, suggested that she move in with us to ease her condition. I was against it, knowing it would permanently ruin our marriage. But Jack insisted, and Margaret moved in. The first weeks after Margaret moved in proved to be a nightmare. Every morning she would get up early and wander silently through the house, looking in every corner, checking for cleanliness. If she found even the slightest speck, she immediately demanded that I rewash and rewipe everything. Sometimes I had to repeat the same action several times until she was satisfied with the result. The round-the-clock attention she demanded exhausted me mentally and physically. She constantly complained of pain and fatigue, even though the doctors said her condition was stable. These complaints became an excuse to force me to fulfill her whims. She needed water. Then when I brought water, she suddenly remembered that she wanted morsels. Or she would ask me to make tea and then refuse it, claiming it was too hot or cold. Every morning began the same way, with complaints of feeling unwell and demands for immediate help. Even at night, she would wake up and call me to help her turn over in bed or bring another pillow. I hardly slept at all, constantly in a state of readiness to fulfill her every whim. All this time I did not feel like the mistress of my own home, but a servant, obliged to fulfill the wishes of my mistress. My personal space was gone, my needs no longer mattered. I felt completely subject to Margaret's will. and this feeling depressed me more and more every day. But the most shocking thing of all was what lay ahead. One day, coming home earlier than usual, I found Margaret engaged in a strange occupation. She was sitting in the kitchen reading my private correspondence with her friends. When I asked what she was doing, she calmly replied that she was just wondering what her sister-in-law was up to. It was a blatant invasion of my privacy and I couldn't let it go unchecked. I approached Jack and demanded that he take action. But instead of support, I heard accusations that I was dramatizing and exaggerating the problem. My mom was just showing concern for me. This situation reached a point of no return. I packed up and left the house, leaving Jack and Margaret to deal with each other. Several months passed. Leaving home was a difficult decision for me, but a necessary one. I could no longer tolerate the constant pressure and criticism from Margaret and Jack's indifference. I rented a small apartment and began to rebuild my life. I got a job, made new friends, and even started exercising. I felt free and happy for the first time in years. But one night when I got home, I saw that my apartment door was open. No one was inside, but all the things were scattered on the floor, dishes were broken. As soon as I discovered that the apartment had been broken into, I immediately dialed the police. They arrived surprisingly quickly, promptly proceeded to inspect the crime scene, and asked me a lot of questions. A few days passed and I received a call from the investigations department. They informed me that a suspect had been found. To my utter amazement, it was Margaret. It turned out that she had been following me for a long time and was determined to teach me a lesson for leaving my family. I contacted Jack to tell him what had happened. Upon hearing the news, he too was in a state of shock. He assured me that he had no idea of his mother's actions and that he would look into the matter now. He apologized to me and promised that he would do everything he could to rectify the situation. Margaret was arrested and charged with hooliganism and burglary. The court sentenced her to 2 years probation and ordered her to undergo psychotherapy. After that incident, things changed between us. Jack started listening to me more and realizing that his mother was really wrong. She needed help, promising that he would no longer allow Margaret to interfere in our lives. We decided to give our marriage a second chance and started living together again. Now our relationship was based on mutual respect and trust.